Alexey Alexandrovitch found nothing unusual or improper in the fact that his wife and Vronsky had been sitting by themselves and having a rather lively talk together. He noticed that to others in the drawing‐room it seemed unusual and improper, and therefore it seemed to him also improper. He decided that he ought to speak about it to his wife. When he reached home, Alexey Alexandrovitch, according to his usual custom, went to his library, threw himself into his armchair, and opened his book at the place marked by a paper cutter in an article on papistry, and read till the clock struck 1, as he usually did. From time to time he passed his hand across his high forehead, and shook his head, as if to drive away an importunate thought. At his usual hour he arose, and he prepared to go to bed. Anna Arkadyevna had not yet returned. With his book under his arm, he went upstairs, but that evening, instead of pursuing his usual train of reflections and thinking over his governmental duties, his mind was occupied with his wife and the disagreeable impression which her behavior had caused him. Contrary to his habit, instead of going to bed, he walked up and down the rooms with his arms behind his back. He could not go to bed because he felt that first it was incumbent upon him to ponder anew over the exigency that had arisen. When Alexey Alexandrovitch made up his mind that he must have a talk with his wife, it seemed to him very simple and natural, but now, as he reflected, it occurred to him that the matter was complicated and perplexing. Alexey Alexandrovitch was not jealous. Jealousy in his opinion was insulting to a wife, and a husband should trust in her. But he did not ask himself why one should trust her, that is to say, why a man should expect a young wife always to love him. But he had not felt any lack of confidence simply because he trusted her, and said to himself that it was the proper thing to do. But now, although it was his conviction that jealousy is a disgusting state of mind, and that it was his duty to trust his wife, and that his faith was still intact, yet he felt that he was placed in an illogical and ridiculous position, and he knew not what he ought to do. Alexey Alexandrovitch was now standing face to face with life, with the possibility that his wife was in love with someone else besides him, and this seemed to him very senseless and incomprehensible, because it was life itself. All his life he had lived and labored in a round of official duties concerned with the reflections of life, and whenever he came in contact with life itself he was revolted by it. Now he experienced a sensation such as a man feels who, passing calmly over a bridge above a precipice, suddenly discovers that the arch is broken, and that the abyss yawns beneath his feet. This abyss was actual life, the bridge, the artificial life which he had been living. The idea that his wife could love another man occurred to him for the first time, and filled him with terror. Without undressing, he kept walking back and forth with regular steps, over the echoing parquetry floor of the dining-room lighted with a single burner, over the carpet of the dark drawing-room, where the light fell on his recently painted full-length portrait, over the divan, and then through his wife's boudoir, where 2 candles were burning, lighting up the portraits of parents and friends, and the pretty trinkets upon her writing-table, so long familiar to him. When he reached the door of her bedroom, he turned and went back. At the end of each turn in his pacing back and forth, and especially on the hardwood floor of his brightly lighted dining-room, he would stop and say to himself, "Yes, this must certainly be cut short. It must be decided. I must tell her my way of looking at it." And then he would turn back again. "But what can I say? What decision can I make?" he would ask himself by the time he reached the drawing-room, and find no answer. "But, after all," he would say, as he turned in the library, "what has been done? Nothing. She had a long talk with him. What of that? But whom not does a society woman talk with? To be jealous is degrading both to her and me," he would say to himself as he reached her boudoir. But this reasoning, which had hitherto had such weight, had now lost its cogency. From the door of her sleeping-room he returned again to the hall, but, as he crossed the dark drawing-room, He thought he heard a voice saying to him, "It is not so. The fact that the others noticed this signifies that there must be something in it." And by the time he reached the dining room again he was saying, "Yes, the thing must be decided, and broken short off." And once more in the drawing room, just before he turned about, he would ask himself, "How can I decide? How can I tell her?" And then he would ask himself, what had happened? And reply, "Nothing," and remember that jealousy is a feeling degrading to a woman. But again in the drawing room he would feel persuaded that something had happened. His thoughts, like his steps, followed the same circle, and he struck no new idea. He recognized this, rubbed his forehead, and sat down in her boudoir. There, as he looked at her table, with its malachite writing tablet, and a letter unfinished, his thoughts took another direction. He began to think of her, and how she would feel. His imagination vividly showed him her personal life, her thoughts and her desires, and the idea that she might, that she must, have her individual life apart from his, seemed to him so terrible that he hastened to put it out of his mind. This was the abyss which it was so dreadful for him to gaze into. To penetrate by thought and feeling into the soul of another was a psychical effort strange to Alexey Alexandrovitch. He considered it a pernicious and dangerous mental habit. "And what is most terrible," he said to himself, "is that this senseless uncertainty comes on me just as I am about to bring my work to completion." He referred to a scheme which he was at that time managing. "And when I need perfect freedom from agitation, and all my mental powers. What is to be done? I am not one of those men who can endure agitation and annoyance, and have the strength of mind to face them. I must reflect. I must take some stand and get rid of this annoyance," he added aloud. "I do not admit that I have any right to probe into her feelings, or to scrutinize what is going on in her heart. That belongs to her conscience, and comes into the domain of religion," he said to himself, feeling some consolation that he had found a domain of law applicable to the circumstances that had arisen. "So," he continued, "the questions related to her feelings and the like are questions of conscience, in which I have no concern. My duty lies clearly before me. As head of my family, I am bound to guide her, and therefore, to a certain degree, I am responsible. I must point out the danger which I see. I must watch over her, and even use my powers. I must speak to her." And Alexey Alexandrovitch formulated in his mind everything that he should say to his wife. While he was thinking it over, he regretted the necessity of wasting his time and his intellectual powers in family matters. But, in spite of him, his plan assumed, in his thought, the clear, precise, and logical form of a report. "I must make her understand as follows. First, the meaning and importance of public opinion and decorum. Secondly, the religious significance of marriage. Thirdly, if necessary, the unhappiness which it might cause her son. Fourthly, the unhappiness which might befall herself." And Alexey Alexandrovitch twisted his fingers together, palms down, and made the joints crack. This gesture, of joining his hands and stretching his finger joints, a bad habit, calmed him, and conduced to the precision of which he now stood in such need. A carriage was heard driving up to the house. Alexey Alexandrovitch stopped in the middle of the hall. He heard his wife's step on the stairway. Alexey Alexandrovitch had his sermon all ready, but still he stood there, squeezing his crossed fingers and trying to make the joints crack. One joint cracked. Even as he heard her light steps on the stairs he was conscious of her presence, and, though he was satisfied with his sermon, he dreaded the explanation that was imminent. Anna entered with bent head, playing with the tassels of her bashlyk, or Turkish hood. Her face shone with a bright glow, but this bright glow did not betoken joy. It reminded one of the terrible glow of a conflagration against the midnight sky. When she saw her husband, she raised her head and smiled, as if she had awakened from a dream. "You are not abed yet? What a miracle!" she said, taking off her beshluak, and, without pausing, she went into her dressing‐room, crying, "It's late, Alexey Alexandrovitch," as she got to the door. "Anna, I must have a talk with you." "With me?" she said in astonishment, coming out into the hall and looking at him. "What is it? What about?" she asked and sat down. "Well, let us talk then, if it is so necessary, but I would much rather go to sleep." Anna said what came to her tongue, and was astonished to hear herself, astonished at her own facility at telling a lie. How perfectly natural her words sounded, and how probable that she wanted to go to sleep. She felt herself clad in an impenetrable armor of falsehood. She felt that some invisible power assisted her and sustained her. "Anna, I must give you a warning." "A warning?" she exclaimed. "Why?" She looked at him so innocently, so gaily, that any one who did not know her as her husband did, would have noticed nothing unnatural either in the tone of her voice or in the meaning of what she said. But for him, who knew her, who knew that when he was 5 minutes later than usual she always remarked on it, and asked the reason, for him who knew that her first impulse was always to tell him of her pleasures and her sorrows, for him now to see the fact that Anna took special pains not to observe his agitation, that she took special pains not to say a word about herself, all this was very significant. He saw that the depths of her soul, hitherto always opened to his gaze, were now shut away from him. Moreover, by her tone he perceived that she was not confused by this, but as it were she said openly and without dissimulation, "Yes, I am a sealed book, and so it must be, and will be from henceforth." He felt as a man would who should come home and find his house barricaded against him. "Perhaps the key will yet be found," thought Alexey Alexandrovitch. "I want to warn you," said he, in a gentle voice, "lest by your imprudence and your thoughtlessness you give people cause to talk about you. Your rather too lively conversation this evening with Count Vronsky," he pronounced this name slowly and distinctly, "attracted attention." He finished speaking, and looked at Anna's laughing eyes, now terrible to him because they were so impenetrable, and he saw all the idleness and uselessness of his words. "You are always like this," she said, as if she had not understood him, and intentionally had understood only the last part of what he said. "Sometimes you don't like it because I am bored, and sometimes you don't like it because I have a good time. I was not bored this evening. Does that disturb you?" Alexey Alexandrovitch trembled. Again he stretched his fingers till the knuckles cracked. "Ah, I beg of you, don't crack your fingers. I detest it so," said she. "Anna, is this you?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch, trying to control himself, and stopping the movement of his hands. "Yes, but what is it?" she asked with a sincere and almost comic astonishment. "What do you want of me?" Alexey Alexandrovitch was silent, and passed his hand across his brow and over his eyes. He felt that, instead of having done as he intended, that is, instead of having warned his wife of her errors in the sight of the world, he was agitated at what concerned her conscience, and was perhaps striking some imaginary wall. "This is what I wanted to say," he continued coldly and calmly, "and I beg you to listen to me until I have done. As you know, I regard jealousy as an insulting and degrading sentiment, and I never allow myself to be led away by it. But there are certain laws of propriety which one cannot cross with impunity. This evening, judging by the impression which you made, I am not the only one that noticed it, all did. You did not conduct yourself at all in a proper manner." "Decidedly I do not understand at all," said Anna, shrugging her shoulders. "He does not really care," she thought. "All that he fears is the opinion of the world. You are not well, Alexey Alexandrovitch," she added, rising and starting to go to her room. But he stepped in front of her, as if to prevent her from going. Never had Anna seen his face so displeased and ugly. She remained standing, tipping her head to one side, while with quick fingers she began to pull out the hairpins. "Well, I will hear what you have to say," she said in a calm, bantering tone. "I shall even listen with interest, because I should like to know what it is all about." She herself was astonished at the assurance and calm naturalness with which she spoke, as well as at her choice of words. "I have no right to examine your feelings. I think it is useless, and even dangerous," Alexey Alexandrovitch began. "If we probe too deeply into our hearts, we run the risk of touching on what we ought not to perceive. Your feelings concern your conscience. But in presence of yourself, of me, and of God, I am in duty bound to remind you of your obligations. Our lives are united, not by men, but by God. Only by crime can this bond be broken, and such a crime brings its own punishment." "I don't understand at all. Oh, heavens, how sleepy I am!" said Anna, swiftly running her hand over her hair and taking out the last pin. "Anna, in the name of heaven, don't speak so," he said gently. "Maybe I am mistaken, but believe me, what I say to you is as much for your advantage as for mine. I am your husband, and I love you." Anna's face for an instant grew troubled, and the mocking fire disappeared from her eyes, but the word "love" irritated her. "Love," she thought. "Does he know what it means? If he had never heard that there was such a thing as love, he would never have used that word." "Alexey Alexandrovitch, truly, I don't know what you mean," she said. "They say you find—" "Allow me to finish. I love you, but I am not speaking for myself. Those who are chiefly interested are our son and yourself. It is quite possible, I repeat, that my words may seem idle and ill-judged. Possibly they are the result of mistake on my part. In that case, I beg you to forgive me. But if you yourself feel that there is the least foundation for my remarks, then I earnestly urge you to reflect, and, if your heart inclines you, to confide in me." Alexey Alexandrovitch, without noticing the fact, had spoken a very different discourse from the one that he had prepared. "I have nothing to say," and she added in a sprightly tone, scarcely hiding a smile, "Truly, it is time to go to bed." Alexey Alexandrovitch sighed, and, without speaking further, went to their chamber. When she reached the room he was already in bed. His lips were sternly set, and he did not look at her. Anna got into bed, every moment expecting that he would speak to her again. She both feared it and desired it, but he said nothing. She waited long without moving, and then forgot all about him. She was thinking of someone else. She saw him, and was conscious of her heart throbbing with emotion and with guilty joy. Suddenly she heard a slow and regular sound of snoring. Alexey Alexandrovitch at first seemed to be startled himself and stopped, but at the end of a second the snoring began again with monotonous regularity. "Too late, too late," she whispered with a smile. She lay for a long time thus, motionless, with open eyes, the shining of which it seemed to her she herself could see in the darkness. From this time began a new life for Alexey Alexandrovitch and his wife. Nothing unusual happened. Anna continued to go into society, and was especially often at the Princess Betsy's, and everywhere she met Vronsky. Alexey Alexandrovitch saw it, but was powerless to prevent it. Whenever he tried to bring about an explanation, she raised up against him an impenetrable wall of humorless perplexity. Outwardly everything was the same, but their relations had completely changed. Alexey Alexandrovitch, a remarkably strong man in matters requiring statesmanship, here found himself powerless. Like an ox, submissively lowering its head, he waited the blow of the axe which he felt was lifted against him. Whenever he began to think about it, he felt that once more he must try by gentleness, tenderness, reason, to save Anna, and bring her back to him. Every day he made up his mind to speak, but as soon as he made the attempt, that evil spirit of falsehood which possessed her seemed to lay hold of him also, and he spoke not at all in the tone in which he meant to speak. Involuntarily, what he said was spoken in his tone of raillery, which seemed to cast ridicule on those who would speak as he did. And this tone was not at all suitable for the expression of the thoughts that he wished to express. What had been for nearly a whole year the sole desire of Vronsky's life, changing all his former desires, what Anna had looked upon as an impossible, a terrible, and therefore the more fascinating, dream of bliss, was at last realized. Pale, with quivering lower jaw, he stood over her, begging her to be calm, himself not knowing how or why. "Anna, Anna," he said with trembling voice. "Anna, for God's sake!" But the more intensely he spoke, the lower she hung her once proud, joyous, but now humiliated head, and she crouched all down, and dropped from the divan, where she had been sitting, to the floor at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet had he not held her. "My God, forgive me!" she sobbed, pressing his hands to her breast. She felt that she was such a sinner and criminal that nothing remained for her except to crouch down and beg for forgiveness, and now there was nothing else for her in life but him, so that to him alone she turned her prayer for forgiveness. As she looked at him she felt her humiliation physically, and she could say no more. But he felt exactly as a murderer must feel when he sees the lifeless body of his victim. This lifeless body was their love, the first epoch of their love. There was something horrible and repulsive in the recollection of the terrible price that they had paid for this shame. The shame in the presence of their spiritual nakedness oppressed him and took hold of him. But in spite of all the horror felt by the murderer in the presence of the body of his victim, he must cut it in pieces, must bury it, must take advantage of his crime. And, as with fury and passion the murderer throws himself on the dead body and drags it and cuts it, so he covered her face and shoulders with kisses. She held his hand and did not stir. Yes, these kisses were what had been bought with this shame. Yes, and this hand, which will always be mine, is the hand of my accomplice. She raised his hand and kissed it. He fell on his knees and tried to look into her face, but she hid it and said nothing. At last, as if trying to control herself, she made an effort to rise, and pushed him away. Her face was still as beautiful as ever, even so much more was it pitiful. "All is ended," said she. "I have nothing but thee. Remember that." "I cannot help remembering it, since it is my life. A moment before this happiness—" "What happiness?" she cried, with contempt and horror. And horror involuntarily seized him also. "For God's sake, not a word more!" She quickly got up and moved away from him, and with a strange expression of hopeless despair, such as he had never seen before, on her face, she stood aloof from him. She felt that at that moment she could not express in words the sense of shame, rapture, and horror at this entrance into a new life, and she did not wish to speak about it or vulgarize the feelings with definite words. But even afterwards, on the next day, on the third day, not only did she fail to find words in which to express the complication of these feelings, but she could not even find thoughts by which to formulate to herself all that was in her soul. She said to herself, "No, I cannot think about this. By and by, when I am calmer." But this calmness never came. Every time when the questions arose, what had she done? And what would become of her? And what ought she to do? She was filled with horror, and she compelled herself not to think about them. "By and by," she repeated, "when I am calmer." On the other hand, during sleep, When she had no control of her thoughts, her situation appeared in its ugly nakedness. One dream almost every night haunted her. She dreamed that she was the wife both of Vronsky and of Alexey Alexandrovitch, and that both lavished their caresses on her. Alexey Alexandrovitch kissed her hands and said, weeping, "How happy we are now!" Alexey Vronsky also was there, and he was her husband. She was amazed that she had ever believed such a thing possible, and she laughed as she explained to them that this was far simpler, that both would henceforth be satisfied and happy. But this dream weighed on her like a nightmare, and she always awoke in a fright. Even in the first weeks after Levin returned from Moscow, every time that with flushed cheeks and a trembling in his limbs he remembered the shame of his rejection, he would say to himself, "I blushed and trembled like this, and I felt that all was lost when I got 1 in physics and had to go into the 2nd class. And I thought myself irretrievably ruined when I bungled in my sister's affairs, which were confided to me. And now the years have gone by, and I look back and wonder how it could disturb my mind. It will be just the same with my disappointment this time. Time will pass, and I shall grow callous." But 3 months passed away, and the callousness did not come, and it was as painful for him to remember it as on that first day. He could not reconcile himself to the fact that, after dreaming so long of family life, after being, as he thought, so well prepared for it, not only was he not married, but found himself farther than ever from marriage. He felt painfully, as all those around him felt, that it is not good for a man of his age to live alone. He remembered that before his departure from Moscow he had once said to his cowherd, Nikolai, a simple-hearted muzhik with whom he liked to talk, "Do you know, Nikolai, that I am thinking of getting married?" Whereupon Nikolai had instantly replied as if there could not be the slightest doubt about it, "This ought to have been long ago, Konstantin Dmitrich." And now marriage was farther off than ever. The place was taken, and when, exercising his imagination, he put into that place some young girl of his acquaintance, he felt that it was perfectly impossible. Moreover, the recollection of how Kitty refused him, and of the part which he played still tormented him with mortification. It was idle to say that he was not to blame in this. This recollection, taken together with other mortifying experiences of the same sort, made him quiver and grow red in the face. He had on his conscience, as every man has, the remembrance of evil deeds for which he should have repented. But the remembrance of these evil deeds did not trouble him nearly so much as the feeling of his humiliation, slight as it really was. It was a wound that refused to heal. He could not keep out of his mind his rejection, and the miserable position in which he must have been placed in the eyes of others. Time and labor, however, brought their balm. The painful impressions little by little began to fade in presence of the events of the country life, important in reality, in spite of their apparent insignificance. Each week his thoughts turned to Kitty with less frequency. He even began to await with impatience the news that she was married, or was going to be married, hoping that this event would bring healing in the same way as the pulling of a tooth may. Meantime spring came, beautiful, friendly, without treachery or false promises, a spring such as fills plants and animals, no less than men, with joy. This splendid season gave Levin new zeal, and confirmed his resolution to tear himself from the past so as to reorganize his solitary life on conditions of permanence and independence. Although many of the plans that he had formed on his return to the country had not been put into effect, yet the most essential one, that his life should be kept pure, had been realized. He experienced none of that sense of shame which ordinarily tormented him after a fall, and he could look fearlessly into men's eyes. In February he had received a letter from Marya Nikolaevna, who informed him that his brother's health was failing, and that he would not use any remedies. In consequence of this letter he had immediately gone to Moscow, where he persuaded Nikolai to consult a physician, and then to go abroad for the baths. He succeeded so well in persuading his brother and in lending him money for the journey without exasperating him, that he felt quite satisfied with himself. Besides his farm labourers, which especially occupied his attention that spring, and his ordinary reading, Levin was deeply engaged in writing a work on rural economy, which he had begun during the winter. His theory was that in farming the labourer's temperament is a factor as important as climate or the soil, and that consequently all the deductions of agronomic science are drawn, not from the premises of soil and climate alone, but from the soil, the climate, and the certain unchangeable character of the labourer. Thus, notwithstanding his loneliness, or in consequence of his loneliness, his life, therefore, was very busy and full. Only occasionally he felt the need of some one besides Agafya Mikhailovna, with whom to communicate the ideas that came into his head. However, he brought himself to discuss with her about physics, the theories of rural economy, and, above all, philosophy. Philosophy was Agafya Mikhailovna's favourite subject. The spring opened late. During the last weeks of Lent the weather was clear but cold. During the day the snow melted in the sun, but at night the mercury went down to 7 degrees. The crust on the snow was so thick that carts could go anywhere across the fields. It snowed on Easter Sunday. Then suddenly, on the following day, a warm wind blew, the clouds drifted over, and for 3 days and 3 nights a warm and heavy rain fell ceaselessly. On Thursday the wind went down, and then over the earth was spread a thick grey fog, as if to conceal the mysteries that were accomplishing in nature. Under this fog the fields were covered with water, the ice was melting and disappearing, the brooks ran more swiftly, foaming and muddy. Toward evening the Krasnaya Gorka, or Red Hill, began to show through the fog, the clouds scattered like snipe, and spring in reality was there in all her brilliancy. The next morning the sun rose bright and quickly melted away the thin sheet of ice that still covered the ponds, and the warm atmosphere grew moist with the vapours rising from the earth. The old grass and the young blades peeping from the sod, with its tiny needles, the buds on the snowball trees, the currant bushes, and the sticky, sappy birch trees, grew green, swelled, and on their branches powdered with golden bloom swarms of honeybees buzzed in the sun. Invisible larks trilled their songs over the velvet of the green and the prairies freed from snow. Lapwings lamented for their hollows and marshes, submerged by the stormy waters. The wild swans and geese flew high in the air with their calls of spring. The cattle, with rough hair and spots worn bare, lowed as they went out to pasture. The bandy-legged lambs gambolled around the bleating ewes, soon to lose their wool. Swift-footed children ran barefoot over the wet paths, where their footprints were left like fossils. The peasant women gossiped gaily around the edge of the pond, where they were bleaching their linen, and in the yards resounded the axes of the muzhiks, repairing their ploughs and their wagons. Spring had really come. Levin put on his heavy boots and, for the first time, his sleeveless cloth coat instead of his fur shuba, and went out to look over his estate, tramping through the brooklets which dazzled his eyes as they glanced in the sun, and stepping, now on a cake of ice, and now in sticky mud. Spring is the epoch of plans and projects. Levin, as he went out into his court, no more definitely knew what he would first take in hand in his beloved farming than the tree in early spring knows how and why his young sprouts and branches grow out from their enveloping buds. But he felt that he was going to originate the most charming projects and the most sensible plans. He went first to see his cattle. The cows had been let out into the yard, and with their smooth new coats of hair glistening as they warmed themselves in the sun, they were lowing as if to beg permission to go out to pasture. Levin knew them all, even to the minutest particulars. He contemplated them with satisfaction, and gave orders to take them to pasture, and to let the calves out into the yard. The cowboy gaily started to drive them out into the field. The milkmaids, gathering up their petticoats and splashing through the mud with bare feet, white as yet and free from tan, chased the bellowing calves, silly with the rapture of spring, and with switches kept them from escaping from the yard. Admiring the young cattle which the year had brought, for they were uncommonly beautiful, the oldest already as large as a peasant's cow, and Pava's daughter 3 months old, as big as a yearling, Levin ordered the trough to be brought out for them, and their hay to be given them behind gratings. He found, however, that these gratings, which had been made in the autumn but were not used during the winter, were out of repair. He sent for the carpenter, who was supposed to be busy repairing the threshing machine, but it seemed that the carpenter was not there. He was repairing the harrows, which should have been repaired during Lent. This made Levin very indignant. He was indignant at this everlasting repetition of such slovenliness, against which he had so many years struggled with all his might. The gratings, as he soon learned, had not been in use during the winter, had been carried to the stable, where, as they were of light construction and meant only for calves, they had been broken. Moreover, it appeared that nothing had been done to the harrows and other agricultural implements, which should have been inspected and put in order during the winter months, and for this purpose especially he had hired 3 carpenters. The harrows were needed immediately for work in the fields. Levin summoned the overseer. Then he himself went in search of him. The overseer, as radiant as everything else was that day, came from the threshing floor, dressed in a lined lambskin coat. He was twisting a straw between his fingers. "Why isn't the carpenter at work on the threshing machine?" "Oh, yes, that is what I meant to tell you last evening. The harrows had to be repaired. We've got to plough." "Yes, but what were you doing this winter?" "Yes, but why did you hire such a carpenter?" "Where are the gratings for the calves?" "I ordered them to be put in place. You can't do anything with such people," replied the overseer, waving his hands. "Not such people, but such an overseer," said Levin, getting still more angry. "Well, what do I keep you for?" he shouted, but recollecting that shouts did not do any good, he stopped in the middle of his remark and only sighed. "Well, can you get the seed in yet?" he asked after a silence. "Back of Turkino we might tomorrow, or the day after." "And the clover?" "I sent Vasily and Mishka to sow it, but I don't know whether they succeeded. It's muddy." "On how many acres?" 16 acres. "Why not the whole?" cried Levin. He was more indignant because they had sowed only 16 acres instead of 54. He knew by his own experience, as well as by theory, the need of sowing the clover seed as early as possible, almost in the snow, and Levin could never get this done. Not enough people. What can you do with these men? 3 hired men did not come, and then Semen. "Well, you would better have taken them away from the straw." "Yes, I did that very thing." "Where are all the people?" "There are 5 at the compote." He meant to say compost. 4 are moving the oats, so that they should not spoil. Konstantin Dmitrievitch. Levin knew very well that these words, "so that they should not spoil," meant that his English oats saved for seed were already ruined. Again they had not done what he had ordered. "Yes, but did I not tell you during Lent to put in the ventilating chimneys?" he cried. "Don't you be troubled, we will do it all in good time." Levin angrily waved his hand and went to examine his oats in the granary. Then he went to the stables. The grain was not yet spoiled, but the workmen were stirring it up with shovels when they might have let it down from one story to the other. After he had straightened this matter and sent 2 hands to sow the clover, Levin calmed down in regard to his overseer. It was such a lovely day that one could not keep angry. "Ignat!" he cried to his coachman, who, with upturned sleeves, was washing the carriage near the pump. "Saddle me a horse." "Which one?" "Well, Klopik." "I will do so." While he was saddling the horse, Levin again called the overseer, who was busying himself in his vicinity, hoping to be restored to favor, and began to speak with him about the work that he wanted done during the spring and about his plans for carrying on the estate. He wanted the compost spread as soon as possible, so as to have this work done before the first mowing. Then he wanted the farthest field ploughed so that it might be left fallow. All the fields, not half of them, should be attended to with the labourers. The overseer listened attentively, doing his best evidently to approve of his master's plans, but nevertheless his face wore that vexatiously hopeless and melancholy expression which Levin knew so well. This expression seemed to say, "This is all very well and good, but as God shall give." Nothing exasperated Levin so much as this tone, but it was common to all the overseers that had ever been in his service. They all received his projects with the same dejected air, and so he now refrained from getting angry, but he was exasperated, and felt himself still more stimulated for the struggle against this, as it were elemental, force which he could not help calling, "as God shall give," and which constantly opposed him everywhere. "If we have time, Konstantin Dmitrich," said the overseer. "Why shall we not have time? We absolutely ought to hire 15 more workmen, but they can't be had. Some came to-day who asked 70 rubles for the summer." Levin did not speak. Again the opposing force. He knew that, however he might exert himself, he never could hire more than 40, 37, or 38 labourers at a reasonable price. He had succeeded in getting 40, never more, but nevertheless he could not give up vanquished. "Send to Sury, to Sheferovka. If they don't come, we must go for them." "I'm going to go," said Vasily Fedorovitch gloomily, "but then the horses are very feeble." "Buy some more, but then I know," he added with a laugh, "that you will do as little and as badly as you can. However, I warn you that I will not let you do as you please this year. I shall take the reins in my own hands." "Yes, but even as it is you get too little sleep, it seems to me. We are very happy to be under our master's eyes." "Now, have the clover put in on the Berezov bottom, and I shall come myself to inspect it," said he, mounting his little horse, Klopik, which the coachman brought up. "Don't go across the brooks, Konstantin Dmitrich," cried the coachman. "Well, then, by the woods." And on his little lively, easy-going ambler, which whinnied as it came to the pools and which pulled on the bridle, having been too long in the stable, Levin rode out of the muddy courtyard and across the open fields. Happy as Levin had felt in his cow-yard and cattle-pen, he felt still happier out in the field, rhythmically swaying on his easy-going, gentle pony, drinking in the warm air, freshened by the snow as he rode through the forest where the snow still lay here and there rapidly melting in the tracks. He took keen delight in every one of his trees, with greening moss and swelling buds. As he came out from the forest, before him lay a vast stretch of fields. They seemed like an immense carpet of velvet where there was not a bare spot or a marsh, only here and there in the hollows marked with patches of melting snow. The sight of a peasant's mare and colt treading down his fields did not anger him, but he ordered a passing muzhik to drive them out. With the same gentleness he received the sarcastic and impudent answer of the muzhik Ipat, whom he met and asked, "Ipat, shall we put in the seed before very long?" And Ipat replied, "We must plough first, Konstantin Dmitrich." The further he went, the more his good humour increased, and each of his plans for improving his estate seemed to surpass the other. To protect the fields on the south by lines of trees so as to prevent the snow from staying too long. To divide his arable fields into 9 parts, 6 of which should be well dressed, and the other 3 sown down to grass. To build a cow-yard in the farthest corner of one field, and have a pond dug. To have portable enclosures for the cattle, so as to utilize the manure, and thus to cultivate 300 desyatins of wheat, 100 desyatins of potatoes, and 150 of clover, without exhausting the soil. Full of these reflections, he picked his way carefully along so as not to tread down his fields, till at last he reached the place where the labourers were sowing the clover. The cart, loaded with seed, instead of being left on the edge of the field, had been driven into the ploughed land, and his winter wheat was crushed by the wheels and trampled down by the horse. The two laborers were sitting by the edge of the field, evidently smoking a mutual pipe. The earth in the cart, mixed together with the seed, had not been worked over, but was full of hard or frozen lumps. When he saw the master, the laborer Vasily started toward the cart, and Mishka began to sow. This was all wrong, but Levin rarely got angry with his laborers. When Vasily came up to him, Levin ordered him to lead the horse to the side of the field. "It won't do any harm, sir. It will spring up again." "Please do not discuss it," replied Levin, "but do what I say." "I will obey," said Vasily, taking the horse by the head. "What splendid seed, Konstantin Dmitrich," he added to regain favor. "Best kind, but it is frightfully going. You drag a pud on each foot." "But why wasn't the earth sifted?" asked Levin. "Oh, it'll come out all right," replied Vasily, taking up some seed and crushing the lump in his palm. It was not Vasily's fault that they were scattering the unsifted soil, but it was vexatious, nevertheless. Having more than once to his advantage made use of a well-known means of wrecking his vexation, which always seemed to him foolish, Levin now determined to try it and see if he could recover his good temper. He noticed how Mishka strode along dragging huge clods of clay which stuck to each of his feet, so, dismounting, he took the seed cod from Vasily and began to scatter the seed. "Where did you stop?" Vasily touched the spot with his foot, and Levin went on as best he could, scattering the earth with the seed. But it was hard as wading through a marsh, and after he had gone a row he stopped all in a sweat, and returned to the seed cod. "Well, Baron, if that row doesn't come out well next summer, don't blame me for it," said Vasily. "Indeed I won't," replied Levin, gaily, already feeling the efficacy of the means he had employed. "But just look at the summer we're going to have. 'Twill be magnificent. If you'll notice, that's where I sowed last spring. How well I planted it! Why, Konstantin Dmitrich, I work as if I were working for my own father. Well, I don't like to do slack work. What is good for the master is good for us. And look yonder at that field," continued Vasily, pointing to the field. "It delights my heart." "It is a fine spring, Vasily." "Yes, it is such a spring as our old men can't remember. I was at home, and our elder had already sowed an acre of wheat, as he says he can hardly tell it from rye." "But how long have you been sowing wheat?" "Why, you yourself taught us how to sow it year before last. You spared me 2 measures. It gave 8 bushels, and we sowed an acre with it." "Well, look here, see that you break up the earth well," said Levin, as he started for his ambler. "Look after Mishka, and if the seed comes up well, you shall have 50 kopecks a desiatin." "We thank you humbly. We should be content even without that." Levin mounted his horse and rode off to visit his last year's clover field, and then to the field which was already ploughed ready for the summer wheat. The crop of clover in the stubble field was miraculous. It had all survived and was covering with a mantle of green all the ground where the preceding fall the roots of the wheat had been left. The horse sank up to the fetlock, and each foot made a sucking noise as he pulled it out of the half-thawed soil. It was entirely impossible to cross the ploughed land. Only where there was ice would it hold, but in the thawed furrows the horse's legs sank above the fetlock. The ploughed field was excellent. In 2 days the harrowing and sowing could be done. Everything was beautiful. Everything was gay. Levin rode back by way of the brooks, hoping to find the water lower. In fact, he found that he could get across, and, as he waded through, he scared up a couple of wild ducks. There ought to be snipe also, he thought, and a forest guard whom he met on his way to the house confirmed his supposition. He immediately spurred up his horse so as to get back in time for dinner, and to prepare his gun for the evening. Just as Levin reached home, in the best humor in the world, he heard the jingling of bells at the side entrance. "There now, someone from the railroad station," was his first thought. "It's time for the Moscow train. Who can have come? Brother Nikolai? Did he not say that instead of going abroad he might perhaps come to see me?" For a moment it occurred to him disagreeably that his brother Nikolai's presence might spoil his pleasant plans for the spring. But, disgusted at the selfishness of this thought, his mind, so to speak, instantly received his brother with open arms, and he began to hope, with affectionate joy, that it was really he. He hurried his horse, and as he came out from behind the acacia, he saw a hired troika from the railway station and a traveller dressed in a shuba. It was not his brother. "Ah, if it is only some agreeable man to talk with," he thought. "Ah!" he cried, lifting up both arms as he recognized Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Here is the most delectable of guests. Ach, how glad I am to see you! I shall certainly learn from him if she is married, or when she is going to be," he added to himself. This splendid spring morning he felt that the memory of Kitty was not at all painful. "You scarcely expected me, I suppose," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, leaping out of the sledge, with spots of mud on the bridge of his nose, on his cheeks, and on his forehead, but radiant with health and pleasure. "I am come, first, to see you," he cried, throwing his arms around Levin and kissing him. "Secondly, to shoot a few birds, and thirdly, to sell the forest at Yergushovo." "Perfect, isn't it? What do you think of this spring? But how could you have got here in a sledge?" "Travelling is far worse with a telyaga, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," replied the postilion, who was an acquaintance. "Well, indeed, I am delighted to see you again," said Levin, with a genuine smile of boyish joy. He conducted his guest to the room kept in readiness for visitors, and had Stepan Arkadyevitch's things brought up, a gripsack, a gun in its case, and a box of cigars, and then, leaving him to wash and dress himself, he went down to his office to speak about the clover and the ploughing. Agafya Mikhailovna, who had very much at heart the honor of the mansion, met him in the vestibule with questions about dinner. "Do just as you please," replied Levin, as he went out. "Only make haste about it," said he, and went to the overseer. When he returned, Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had washed and combed his hair, was just coming out of his room with a radiant smile, and together they went upstairs. "Well, I am very happy to have got out to your house at last. I shall now learn the mystery of your existence here. Truly, I envy you. What a house! How convenient everything is! How bright and delightful!" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, forgetting that bright days and the springtime were not always there. "And your old nurse! What a charming old soul! All that's lacking is a pretty little chambermaid with an apron on. But that does not suit your severe monastic style. But this is very good." Stepan Arkadyevitch had much interesting news to tell. Especially interesting to Levin was the tidings that his brother, Sergey Ivanovitch, expected to come into the country this summer. But not one word did Stepan Arkadyevitch say about Kitty or any of the Shtcherbatskys. He simply transmitted his wife's greeting. Levin was grateful to him for this delicacy. As usual, he had stored up during his hours of solitude a throng of ideas and impressions which he could not share with any of his domestics, and now he poured into Oblonsky's ears his poetical spring joys, his failures and plans and farming projects, his thoughts and his observations on the books which he had read, and above all the idea of his treatise, the scheme of which consisted, though he himself had not noticed it, of a critique on all former works on farming. Stepan Arkadyevitch, amiable and always ready to grasp a point, showed usual cordiality, and Levin even thought that he noticed a certain flattering consideration in an undertone of tenderness in his treatment of him. The efforts of Agafya Mikhailovna and the cook to get up an especially good dinner resulted in the two friends, who were half starved, betaking themselves to the zerkassa or lunch table and devouring bread and butter, cold chicken, and salted mushrooms, and finally in Levin calling for the soup without the little pasties which the cook had made in hope of surprising the guest. But Stepan Arkadyevitch, though he was used to different kinds of dinners, found everything excellent. The travnik or herb beer, the bread, the butter, and especially the cold chicken, the mushrooms, the shchi or cabbage soup, the fowl with white sauce, and the white Crimean wine, everything was admirable, wonderful. "Perfect! Perfect!" he cried, as he lit a big cigarette after the roast. I feel as if I had escaped the shocks and noise of a ship, and had landed on a peaceful shore. And so you say that the element represented by the working man ought to be studied above all others, and be taken as a guide in the choice of economy expedients. You see, I am a profanus in these questions. But it seems to me that this theory and its applications would have an influence on the working man. Yes, but hold on. I'm not speaking of political economy, but of rural economy considered as a science. You must study the premises, the phenomena, just the same as in the natural sciences, and the working man, from the economical and ethnographical point of view. But here Agafya Mikhailovna entered with the dessert of preserves. Well, now, accept my compliments, Agafya Mikhailovna, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, kissing the ends of his hairy fingers. What nice baked chicken! What delicious beer! Well, Kostya, isn't it time to go?" he added. Levin looked out of the window toward the sun, which was sinking behind the tree-tops, still bare and leafless. "It is time. Kuzma, have the horses hitched up," he cried as he went downstairs. Stepan Arkadyevitch followed him, and carefully removed the canvas covering from the lacquered case, and, having opened it, proceeded to take out his costly gun, which was of the newest pattern. Kuzma, already scenting a generous fee, gave him assiduous attention, and helped him put on his stockings and his hunting boots, and Stepan Arkadyevitch accepted his aid complacently. "If the merchant Rabinin comes while we are gone, Kostya, I told him to be here to-day. Do me the favor to have him kept till we get back." "Are you going to sell your wood to Rabinin?" "Yes. Why, do you know him?" "Oh, certainly I know him. I have done business with him, positively and finally." Stepan Arkadyevitch burst into a laugh. Positively and finally were the favorite words of the merchant. "Yes, he is very droll in his speech. She knows where her master is going," he added, patting Laska, who was jumping and barking around Levin, licking now his hand, now his boots and gun. A dolgusha, or hunting wagon, was waiting at the steps as they came out. "I had the horses put in, although we have but a little distance to go," said Levin. "But would you rather walk?" "No, I prefer to ride," replied Stepan Arkadyevitch, as he mounted the wagon. He sat down, tucking round his legs a striped plaid, and lighted a cigar. "How can you get along without smoking, Kostya? A cigar, it is not only a pleasure, it is the very crown and sign of delight. This is life indeed. How delightful! I should like to live like this." "What's to prevent?" asked Levin with a smile. "Yes, but you are a fortunate man, for you have everything that you like. You like horses, you have them. Dogs, you have them. Hunting, here it is. An estate, here it is." "Perhaps it is because I enjoy what I have, and don't covet what I have not," replied Levin, with Kitty in his mind. Stepan Arkadyevitch understood, and looked at him without speaking. Levin was grateful to Oblonsky because he avoided speaking about the Shtcherbatskys with his usual tact, perceiving that Levin dreaded to speak about them. But now he felt anxious to find out how matters stood, but he did not dare to inquire. "Well, how go your affairs?" asked Levin, realizing how selfish it was in him to think only of himself. Oblonsky's eyes glistened with gaiety. "You will not admit that one can want hot rolls when he has his monthly rations. In your eyes it is a crime. But for me, I cannot admit the possibility of living without love," he replied, construing Levin's question in his own fashion. "What's to be done about it? I am so constituted. And it is a fact. It does so little harm to any one else, and gives one so much pleasure." "What? There is a new one, is there?" asked Levin. "There is, brother. You know the type of the woman in Ossian? These women that you see in dreams. But they really exist, and are terrible. Woman, you see, is an inexhaustible theme. You can never cease studying her. She always presents some new phase." "So much the better not to study her, then." "Not at all. Some mathematician has said that happiness consisted in searching for truth and never finding it." Levin listened and said no more, and, notwithstanding all the efforts which he made, he could not in the least enter into his friend's soul, and understand his feelings and the charm of studying such women.